Welcome to the Whitmercast, a podcast by the John Whitmer Historical Association. We bring you essays, interviews, panel discussions, and broadcasts related to Mormon history and restoration studies. My name is Jill Brim, having taught U.S. History and Humanities at Dixie State University. I'll be your host for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in. If you would like to join JWHA or visit our entire backlog of episodes, as well as John Whitmer journals, go to jwha.info. We have a great episode lined up for you today. We'll be talking to Melvin C. Johnson. Mel was a member originally of the U.S. Army Paratroop Infantry. He now resides in Mesquite, Nevada, and is a retired professor of English and history. His interests include 19th century historical intersections of the American West and the Restoration denominations inspired by Joseph Smith, Jr. His books and articles have won a number of awards. He is a writer, author, columnist, and historian, having presented and presided at nearly 100 history conferences. Welcome, Mel.
Welcome, Jill. It's great to be here. It's great to be back at Dixie State University. I graduated here a lifetime ago. The campus is beautiful and quite different.
Well, we're delighted to have you here. We know you've had years of research and writing, in particular focusing on Lyman Wight. Your book, of course, Polygamy on the Pedernales River in Texas. So today, most of us are familiar then with Lyman Wight having been incarcerated with Joseph Smith Jr. at the Liberty Jail. But could you just give us kind of an outline then, an introduction to Lyman Wight?
Sure, my pleasure. Lyman Wight was born in Connecticut before 1800. He was a young veteran of the War of 1812, had immigrated to Ohio, what is now the Western Case Reserve, fairly conservative in Protestant religion, proto-evangelical perhaps, a communitarian, primitive, apostolic economics, one for all for one. We know him primarily among the Utah church as a stalwart follower of Joseph Smith. He was that indeed, and he was far more than that. He was a stake president, he was an apostle, he was a renegade who ran off to Texas with his colony from Wisconsin. We're able to determine Joseph Smith's development of endowment in Kirtland and Nauvoo by what was done at the first Restoration Mormon temple west of the Mississippi, built at Zodiac, Texas in 1851. Dr. Richard Bennett from BYU says, yes, look at those endowments as the beginning of where Joseph Smith began, and then later on, of course, Brigham Young would further develop them. He would die in Texas. He would not make up with Brigham Young and the apostles in Utah. He had his mission from Joseph, and nobody was going to tell him differently. Interestingly enough, only a minority of his followers would later reconvert to the Utah church. The great majority joined the reorganized Latter-day Saints, 1865 in a revival in Central Texas Hill Country, in San Bernardino, which became a large RLDS center before the 20th century, and many journeyed back to the Midwest to settle in Nebraska and Iowa. And the archives of the Church Community of Christ are filled with old Whiteite memoirs, journals, diaries, and papers.
Thank you so much. Going back then to Lyman Wight's early participation in the Restoration, We know then that he was accused by David Patton of teaching false doctrine in 1836, and that a trial ensued after that with the High Council. So what was the outcome of that trial, and what happened then with the relationship with David Patton and Lyman Wight?
This is a fun question. It shows that Lyman Wight was his own thinker and did not change his mind much at all. Patton was unhappy with some of his teachings, and it turned out that Lyman Wight was not sanctioned, but corrected and remained in his position. Of interest, when Light was appointed to the Quorum of the Twelve in 1841, he took the seat of David W. Patton, who had been killed at Crooked River.
Interesting. So he took the same position then
He was
the 12.
Yeah, but David Patton was the head of the Quorum of 12 when he was killed at the Battle at Crooked River, and when, after all of the troubles of 39 and 40, and having spent all those months with Joseph and the others in Liberty Jail, was appointed to the Quorum of 12 as the junior member.
Wow. You mentioned then that Lyman Wight was a communitarian. So he liked this idea then of the property being together and the saints residing together. So is this why he did not like the sale of land in Jackson County, and he opposed W.W. Phelps and John Whitmer from selling their land?
Indeed, he thought all of the land of the members was dedicated to the welfare of the church and the need of its members. Also understand that many of the current FLDS and more conservative Mormon sects look back to Lyman Wight as kind of a prototype figure, meaning all property was held in common, but was directed and used by the leading quorum of the church as they saw fit. If you left the community, you went out empty.
Interesting. Wow, thank you. Now, Lyman Wight was a member then of the stake presidency in Adam-ondi-Ahman.
Yes.
Okay. So very much then he wanted to stay there then and have the church flourish there?
Well, that was his understanding, and that was common among the members at that time. He showed his flexibility in being able to move to Illinois, on to Iowa, to Wisconsin Territory, and help co-manage the pinery missions to send lumber down to Nauvoo for the temple and the Joseph Smith House and the building boom, which was gigantic in the 40s. After the death of Joseph, Brigham really did not want him to go down to Texas, a mission that Joseph had given him. That was based on, where are we going to move the church to? There were people looking at Vancouver Island, California, the Rocky Mountains, and the Republic, a separate country, the Republic of Texas. Lucian Woodworth, a member of the Council of 50, known as the pagan prophet, so-called by Joseph, was sent on a political mission to the Republic to talk to President Sam Houston. Sam Houston loved the idea of the bloodthirsty, heavily armed Mormons on the frontier between the Comanche Mexicans and the Texans. He said, though, I need to talk to the Texas legislature this December. Woodworth comes back, reports. One of the outcomes, Joseph calls in Lyman Wight and says, the pineries are almost done. You want to go to Texas, and I believe that's a great idea. You and Bishop George Miller should take your colony down there and settle the lands. And then Joseph was murdered, and life changed, as it does.
Excellent. Thank you. Going back to the pineries then, as you mentioned then, with the revelation in 1841 that the temple is going to be built, as well as the Nauvoo House, we have Lyman Wight working on the Nauvoo House Association. So do you think, too, that another reason he considered Texas is because he knew that there would be sufficient timber and lumber in Texas, just as they had found at the pineries in Wisconsin?
Interestingly enough, and that is an excellent question, no. He was looking at it in terms, and understand, he would have been a great real estate agent in building up what Texas was to him. It had a temperate climate. The winters were warm and not very cold. That part was true. He ignored the devastating heat and humidity of central Texas and eastern Texas. He was looking at agriculture, cotton, missionary and converting rich landowners with lots of slaves who would donate their tithings to the building up of the church in Texas.
Thank you. Now, when Joseph Smith receives the 2 letters from Lyman Wight and George Miller, encouraging then Joseph to move the group from Wisconsin to Texas. And then we know from Joseph receiving those 2 letters, reads them, they have a meeting then in Nauvoo, and we have the beginning of the Council of 50.
Yes, that was the genesis of the formation of the Council of 50. The letter from February 15th, 1844, signed by Wight, Miller, and the bishopric at Black River, saying, let's do this. One of the reasons they wanted to move was a reoccurring theme in Restoration history. Federal agents were interfering with the Mormons in trying to get Indian lumber for their sawmills. The federal agents always thought the Mormons were a bad influence on the Indians. They didn't like the idea of the house of Joseph and Judah coming to the Lamanites and creating a new religio-political group of indigenous peoples allied with what was considered an almost outlaw religious native white religion.
Excellent. So then we have the meeting then that's going to happen March the 10th, 1844, and then sending then an initial group down, the send 25 men from the lumber operation to Texas then. As Wight moves then to Texas, do you think he had in his mind from the beginning that he would be creating a temple? When did this evolve?
That's interesting. The 28 families, about 175 people total, moved down, and like anybody on the frontier in America in those days, or on the eastern frontier in the Russian Empire, you're concerned about getting through the winter to the next year. They needed to find a place for arable land. They needed to find a way to make money, and that's where the sawmills came in at Sycamore Springs, just south of Austin on 290. You can see Bee Creek where it enters into the river, was their first sawmill. The following year, they moved 60 miles west to Fredericksburg, set up a sawmill, a grist mill, 180 acres of arable land, sold goods to Fort Martin Scott, a mile and a half away, and interacted with the German colony at Fredericksburg, where JWHA will be going in 2024 for conference. And the Germans got along with the Mormons real well. One of the first arguments that the Texans had when the Mormons showed up was that we don't want these bloodthirsty Mormons here. We're afraid of them. And Noah Smithwick, an old settler, a teenage veteran of the war with Mexico for independence in Texas, said, think this through. He echoed Sam Houston. They're armed. They have lots of weapons. Let's send them west to Fredericksburg, where they and the Germans can protect us in Austin. So no, they weren't thinking about temples as such. Right then, they were creating a community. After 2 years, the community had been so sustained, they could think about it because the community had broken from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and wanted a temple to do their sealings and endowments. William Smith of the Covington Schism said, I'm all for it. The prophet's brother said, you build it and I'll send people. As a matter of fact, Smith sent almost 20 people who went through the Zodiac, Texas temple.
This is fascinating. So their first motivation then, or their first trading partners then, are the military and the Germans when they arrive then.
Well, the very first was in Austin that first year. They built the jail. They built the governor's mansion. They may not have been liked by the old settlers, but they were more than willing to work with them. Also, the Mormons had something that nobody else had down there. Remember, the largest communities in Texas were 700 and 800, 900. They had industrialized milling for grinding corn and wheat. The women were grinding them in mortars with pestles. All of a sudden, you could take your bag of harvest to the mill and have it returned to you as grist meal or flour. There were reasons why we won't worry about strange Mormon religious proceedings if we're going to be able to get cornbread and beans in the morning.
Also, were the settlers in Texas aware that this group had just come from the pineries as well and were skilled in producing lumber and timber? Were they aware of that?
No, I don't think so, but they became aware very, very quickly. They suspected they were polygamous, which indeed they were, and which the Mormons skillfully shielded the best they could. It was never a reason for moving them along through the counties in central Texas. It was always an economic edge. They brought industrialized milling to wherever they went, and resulted in the development of 3 new counties. Mormons always sat on the commissions, were sheriffs, constables, school superintendents for the county. They were a real asset to Central Texas.
So there was not a lot of animosity then with the government leaders then in Texas?
Not with the government leaders, and surprisingly, not with the neighbors. Now, the Germans got upset in an election, 1850, I think. The Mormons were on all of the boards, held all of the positions. Lyman Wight was Chief Justice of the county. So they decided they would take the county back for the Germans. And indeed they did. One of the myths is the Mormons left Gillespie County and Zodiac. Because of that, there was no need to. The Germans weren't going to persecute them. They didn't care about their family proceedings. What happened was there was a massive flood And if you've lived in Central Texas, as I have, I lived on Mormon Mill Road up in Marble Falls.
Oh, wow.
And when the floods come down the Pedernales, down the Colorado, down the Frio, and all of the others, it is massive. When we were in Marble Falls 2015, 2016, and the rains came that you guys watched on the TV, we had 18 people drowned in the bottoms. We knew people who were killed. The Texas Hill Country, as beautiful as it is, has dangers to it, and water, an excess of water is one of them.
So it can be treacherous.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just like the slot canyons here in southern Utah.
Yeah, very much so.
Oh.
So what happened was the flood wiped out the arable land. They were not able to grow harvest for the next year. So they moved north to Burnett County on Hamilton Creek.
Now, as Wight begins to think then about having a temple and constructing a temple, were the neighbors then suspicious about this, or they didn't really care because they had such a nice trading system in place?
Well, they were more than willing to trade, but I think they were more concerned about surviving themselves, as were the Mormons.
Oh, okay.
What the Germans were interested in was the manufacturing of those huge beams that held up the roof. When the Mormons left the county in 1851, the German farmers scuttled over, disassembled the building, and took the beams.
Really?
So I can show you exactly where the temple was built. I can show you where the houses were, but I can't show you anything other than foundation stones, building blocks, and I can show you where the old cemetery was. It was harrowed under by Schmidzinski in the 1930s. He was afraid Texas was going to put a historical marker on it, which indeed it was. So he destroyed a beautiful, beautiful cemetery. I can show you exactly where Lyman Wight is buried. We can stand on top of him, use a Geiger counter, and it will bounce off the lead-lined coffin.
That is fascinating. Did Lyman Wight's family then remain in Texas, or they went on then with the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
That is a great question. On March 2nd, the 80 or 90 members left in the colony moved with Lyman Wight, who had a vision that they should return to Jackson County. I don't think they would have gone to Jackson County. The old settlers would have killed Lyman. He was that LDS warrior chieftain who terrorized them 20 years earlier. They would have ended up in Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska with those members that did not go to Utah, with Joseph's family that remained. On the second day of the trip, Lyman died, a fit. He was an alcoholic and he was addicted to laudanum. Opium was sold across the counter throughout the United States in the days. So they took the body from Dexter, Texas, down to Zodiac, to the old cemetery that was still standing, and there they buried him. His oldest son, Orange Lysander Wight, what a wonderful name, was a Texas Ranger. He rode the 40 miles to attend his father's funeral. He later said that when the clods of dirt fell upon my father's coffin, those things that he did wrong are forgotten, and we will hold him and cherish him in our memory as our father and husband. He took his mother, the first of Lyman's 4 wives north. And most of the 80 or 90 people went with him into Iowa and Nebraska, and there they rejoined with those members who would later become part of the reorganization in 1860 at Graceland and at the archives in Independence. You will find much material and artifacts of these people. You and I have friends who are descendants of these people in leadership positions in the community of Christ. Many remained in Central Texas and joined the RLDS Church, as I mentioned earlier. And in Bandera, the chapel still stands. The old pews are still in the community. 8 or 9 of the old houses still stand. Interestingly enough, many of the women became lot owners and business people in Bandera, running their own businesses. Some of them were plural wives, hiding their relationships. It was okay to be a polygamous Mormon. Everybody knew you were. You just didn't talk about it. I asked one of the family members in Bandera, and we'll go to Frontier Times Museum in Bandera as part of the 2023 John Whitmer Historical Association Conference next year. And I said, "Didn't your ancestors know they were polygamous?" And she smiled and said, "Of course they did." And I said, "They never talked about it." And she said, "You don't talk about your friends." They got along well.
Wow.
And then later became leaders and businessmen, and the descendants are quite prominent in the communities.
Wow, this is fascinating. So his son, Lyman Wight's son, you said, took a group north. When did Lyman Wight die again, did you say?
1858.
Okay, so the reorganization is going to be 2 years later in Amboy, Illinois. So did they make it up then to the actual meeting in Amboy, Illinois?
I have never looked at the attendance roster. I would imagine some did, but I can't say, yes, that happened. But every last one of them up there joined the church, the RLDS.
And so some are remaining in Texas. Did some from that original group then go back to Texas?
There were 3 with, I can't think of the fervent evangelical RLDS apostle preacher of the 1860s. He took Ballantyne, the former sheriff, and another man down with him to Bandera and Fredericksburg, and held revival meetings for the RLDS right after the Civil War. And they built an old, and this is neat to me because I lived in the South for 40 years and I've seen an old plank wood open floor with pillars at the 4 corners and then boughs laid over the top of the bower. And there he preached the gospel of Joseph reorganized, and they all joined. He was quite a preacher.
This is fascinating. This is the first I've heard any of this. This is amazing. All your years of research, Mel, this is truly interesting.
We have a few minutes. Can I take a quick
Yes.
break on where this started?
Yeah.
I began my expertise as a southern mill town and logging, railroad, and tram road historian in East Texas. It was a gigantic lumber industry. In 1907, Texas produced the 3rd most amount of lumber and milling in the entire nation. In all of my research at Texas Forestry Museum, I kept coming up with these reports of Mormon millers in Central Texas. So I created a database on the old Claris Works program, and I started entering those. And then I went out to Fredericksburg, found an old gentleman who had this gigantic file on Texas Germans and Texas Mormons and said, I need to write about this. I found out about Lyman Wight and John Pierce Hawley. And so we had moved to Salt Lake in 1996. And I got a letter in the mail from William C. Shepherd of Burlington, Wisconsin, one of the presiding high priests of the Strangite Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, parentheses, Strangites, a restoration denomination. Many later joined the RLDS, who said, here, you'll want this. I had no idea who Bill was. And Bill seems to think it was Davis Bitten who he went through. I'm not sure on that. And in the envelope he sent me was a notarized copy of a county record from Nebraska titled Certification of the Records of the Zodiac Temple, Texas.
Oh, my goodness.
And it was signed by Lyman Wight. And I went,
incredible.
What is this? So I went over to Independence. Ron Romig and Barbara Bernauer were so kind to me. And I said, what do you know about Lyman Wight? Ron stood up behind his desk and walked around the corner. And if you've been there, you know how he did. He came around the desk, stepped to the door, turned to the right. One door down left was a closet with a vault. So he doesn't reach in the vault. He reaches on top of the vault, takes down a register, brushes it off, opens it up, and it's a register of endowments, sealings, baptisms for the dead, witnesses, participants, sealers of the Zodiac Temple from 1849 to 1851. So I started talking about it, and people started yelling at me, particularly in Utah. And then finally, by the San Antonio 2016 or 17 MHA meeting, Dick Bennett stood up and said, Mel Johnson got it right. Here's a copy of the records of the first Restoration Mormon Temple west of the Mississippi in Zodiac, Texas. One of the neatest nights of my life.
Oh, my goodness. Wow. Well, with all of your work then, with Lyman Wight in Texas, do you think it was his intent to just, if he had lived longer, just to remain in Texas then and have the church flourish there? What did he, you mentioned he had a vision then of going back to Jackson County.
He had concluded after all of those years that the Utah church wasn't coming to Texas, and neither were the saints living in the Midwest. So he was going back north. Jeremy Wight, one of his descendants, and wrote that wonderful popular history, Wild Ram of the Mountains. Right. I had a wonderful day and night staying at his pack ranch, bunch of llamas. You pack the llamas in Star Valley, Wyoming, and off you go. Was convinced, and he was very active, Utah Latter-day Saint, as almost all of Star Valley is, said, well, he was going to take him on to Utah. And since I was a guest, I was not going to argue with such a generous host. And I said, we'll think about that. My professional historical opinion was that no. He may have wanted to settle in Upper Missouri. I know that he couldn't have gone to Jackson or Independence. As I said, the old settlers would have killed him.
It would have been too dangerous.
Oh, indeed.
Yeah.
This man, during the Mormon-Missouri Civil War, was running around with a bandana, a shirt opened at the collar, waving a cutlass, saying, "Death to the enemies of the church and Joseph." He led the raids on Millport and Gallatin. There was no reason for the settlers to let him live, but to show his character to offset maybe some of the character defects. He was the man who was told by the general that if you turn evidence against Joseph, we'll let you live. And it's witnessed and verified. Lyman tears his shirt open and says, "Shoot and be damned." He was Joseph's man all the way. No, I think if he had lived long enough, he would have gone to Iowa or Illinois or Nebraska, as his son took his first wife, Orange Lysander's mom, to Iowa and Nebraska.
But there may have been some in Utah who would have welcomed him. Do you think?
George A. Smith called the Whiteites who came to Utah the Texas epidemic. There were a lot of them. George A. Smith did not like Lyman. Neither did Orson Hyde and others. There were some like Heber C. Kimball who liked him a lot and had always thought that he would come back to the LDS Church. Some of White's colony did convert to the LDS. Some of them ended up right here in St. George, where we're holding John Whitmer Conference in 2024. And one of them was the presiding elder in the Pine Valley branch for 11 years, 1857 to 1868. There were other old Whiteites up and down Utah. They certainly would have welcomed him, but not as a leader or a hierarchical figure at all. He would have been an old fuddy-duddy by that time. That individual, by the way, in Pine Valley was John Pierce Hawley, whom I've written about. He was converted to the Reorganized Latter-day Saints in the spring of 1870. He had gone on a mission to Iowa for the LDS to convert his family. Nobody converted anybody on either side. He returned, but he was thinking. And an RLDS missionary was over in a little community north of Mountain Meadows and Jacob Hamlin's ranch. And John found out, to his satisfaction, the man, even though John thought he was crazy, literally insane, had the authority to baptize him. So he baptized John, baptized John's brother, George Hawley, both sets of family members. And the following Sunday, John gave his final sermon to the Pine Valley Ward to a very startled congregation.
That he was leaving?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Erastus Snow, Apostle Snow, the leader of the area, blew up. He and John were close. Sometime later, Erastus wrote him and said, basically, all is forgiven. You can step out of the church for a while, but you're always welcome back. And John sent a curt reply saying, I will never return. And he never did.
Wow. And where did John Pierce Hawley pass away then?
Ravenwood, Missouri.
Oh, okay.
He had been a very prominent second-level middle manager in the RLDS Church. He and Joseph Smith III knew each other very, very well, were very close. And he kept operating as a missionary and a mission president in Missouri, in Indian Territory, in Kansas, and was called to go to Texas, which he was really excited about, to preach the RLDS gospel, but had a breakdown. He died at the age of 83 in 1909.
Oh, my goodness.
So he was born in the age of the stagecoach and the riverboat, died after planes had flown and telephones had been around for 25 years.
Wow.
He saw it all.
Oh, my goodness. You know, Mel, what you've really showed us today, too, is that there was interaction between the groups after the many depart from Nauvoo. So among these different groups, then, we're going to see that they do come and see each other. They're not in isolated areas.
Oh, indeed, that's true. We seem to think, well, if you're not in our group of Mormons, then you ignore everybody else because they're apostates or whatever. In fact, these are relatives of one another. They're friends of one another. They've known each other for many, many years. There was transactional intersectionality. Whiteites wrote to the Strangites regularly, not about religion, but about family. They wrote to Utah about family. They wrote to their relatives and friends in Iowa. And Utah and the Strangites and the Cutlerites and the Whiteites, Thompsonites, and who know whatites all wrote one another and visited. And why would they not? Mormonism is the most unique native grown religion in the United States. There is nothing else like it. Every member in every denomination is set aside somehow from the rest of the nation. Alice Cooper is a Bickertonite. And the rest of the world goes, I didn't know that. And we can, Dale Murphy, the baseball player. And when we look into the sectarian world, the impact. Will Bagley, my dear, dear friend, we grew up together in California, said, you cannot understand the American West unless you understand Mormonism. And you certainly can't understand Mormonism if you don't understand the American West.
Excellent. Thank you. So the Zodiac Temple, just in concluding then, Lyman Wight's idea about life in Texas then. So it's going to be used until what year then?
Short term, 2 years, 1851 to 1853. Is that right? No, 1849 to 1851.
Okay.
The flood comes in the spring, wipes out the land, and Lyman says, we need to get happy feet and go find another place.
Okay.
And they go to Hamilton Creek in Burnett County, where that beautiful, beautiful limestone cemetery sits in its isolated splendor on top of a little bluff. Think of a U-shaped group of cedar trees surrounding that cemetery. The only permanent life there, other than the birds and the animals, are cattle. And the cemetery sits there. I led Kenny Mays and Mark Christian on a photography trip there for the LDS portion of the old Deseret Times, Deseret News. And Mark looked with his eyes like a 4-year-old at Christmas and said this was worth the whole trip. And we will see it when we go to Fredericksburg next year.
Oh, thank you. As you've mentioned then, Lyman Wight really does have quite an influence over the areas where we're going to be visiting for the next 3 years with the John Whitmer Historical Association, our annual conference. So this fall in September, we have our 50th anniversary celebration. And of course, we know Lyman Wight, then we've discussed that, his profound influence then at Adam-ondi-Ahman.
His presence as a war chieftain for the Mormons versus the Missouri militia. talk about January 6th. You've got Lyman Wight and the other leaders running around in insurrection in 1838, though they certainly didn't see it that way.
Excellent. And then, of course, as we've mentioned, his time in the Liberty Jail. Then we'll be going out, as you mentioned, in 2023 down to Fredericksburg. How far is Fredericksburg then from the Zodiac area?
3 miles.
Oh, so it's very close.
It's private ground, and I will do my best to convince the Schmidzinskis to let a larger number of people than usual on the ground. I hope they will say yes. The nice thing is the major Whiteite and Mormon influence in the hill country is no longer than 100 miles in diameter. It goes from Bandera in the south, Fredericksburg in the center, and Marble Falls in the north, about 50 miles each way from Fredericksburg. We are going to have some great tours.
This is going to be sensational. You've mentioned, too, the military influence, the fort.
The Texas Ranger Museum is there, Frontier Times Museum, Falls of the Colorado River. Oh, Fort Croghan. They recreated Fort Croghan just the way it was in 1855. It will be amazing.
This will be an amazing tour. And then, of course, we will have in 2024, as you mentioned, in St. George. And so you've talked about this influence then with John Pierce Hawley, then living just up in Pine Valley, so 30 miles from St. George.
Yes. He was one of the original cotton missionaries over in Washington on the other side of the mesa here, and decided it was too hot and sweaty. And when Isaac Rettel became the first man in Pine Valley and went, this is the most beautiful valley in the world with lots of trees. And the Hawley brothers moved right up with the first group.
And, of course, we have Henry Miller, who's at the Pineries with Lyman Wight and George Miller. He will then become part of the United Order in St. George. And
he was the presiding elder down at Beaver Dam Wash and then got wiped out in a flood shortly thereafter, returned to St. George. There is Whiteite influence from Bunkerville to Pine Valley to Washington.
So this is just going to be fascinating then to see all of these influences over the next 3 years. Well, Mel, we just can't thank you enough for this fascinating interview today. We thank you for being here. And for the Whitmer Cast, I'm Jill Brim. Until next time.
We want to thank you for tuning into the Whitmer Cast. This podcast is produced with the help of Bryce Blankenagel, Catherine Pollock, Jill Brim, Joe Geisner, Catherine Hill, and Rachel Killebrew. John Whitmer Historical Association is an educational nonprofit institution with Krista McKay as our president. For more information, visit jwha.info, where you can meet our team and join the association, read past issues of the JWHA Journal, and get updates on upcoming conferences and events. Our theme music is I Love to Tell the Story, composed by Tom Moraine. This podcast is a production of the John Whitmer Historical Association, copyright October 2021, all rights reserved.